Former Vice President Dick Cheney passed away on November 3rd at the age of 84 from complications of pneumonia and cardiac and vascular disease. On Thursday, November 20th, the nation gathered to say goodbye. His funeral took place at Washington National Cathedral in the heart of Washington, D.C., and what unfolded that morning was far more than just another state funeral. It was a collision of American history, political contradiction, and genuine human emotion, all happening under one sacred roof. More than 1,000 people filled the cathedral that day. Former presidents, current leaders, Supreme Court justices, and congressmen from both sides of the aisle came to pay their respects to a man who had spent decades at the center of American power. But what made this particular funeral so remarkable wasn't just who showed up. It was who didn't. And it was the raw, unfiltered moments that reminded everyone in that room that beneath the titles and the politics was simply a father, a grandfather, and a man grappling with the weight of his own legacy. Let me walk you through 5 moments from that day that stood out as truly defining. Moment 1. The glaring absence. The first thing everyone noticed about Dick Cheney's funeral wasn't something that happened inside the cathedral. It was something that didn't happen at all. President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance were not invited to the service. And that simple fact told you everything you needed to know about how far things had deteriorated between Cheney and Trump in the final years of his life. Think about what that absence meant. These are 2 Republican figures from recent American history. Trump relied heavily on Republican support. Cheney served Republican presidents for decades. They represented the same party, and yet when it came time to honor the passing of a former vice president, Trump wasn't welcome in that room. The White House hadn't even issued a presidential proclamation. Trump hadn't made public comments about Cheney's death. It was silence, pure and simple. The reason for this rift was no secret. Cheney had become one of Trump's most vocal Republican critics. After the January 6th Capitol riot, when Trump supporters breached the nation's highest seat of legislative power, Cheney took a stand. He was the first Republican vice president to be driven from office in modern times, partly because of that stance against Trump. And Cheney never backed down. In fact, he went further. In September of 2024, Dick Cheney publicly announced he would vote for Kamala Harris, the Democratic candidate for president. Not because he'd suddenly become a Democrat, but because he genuinely believed Trump posed a threat to the Republic. Those were his words, a threat to the Republic. So when Trump's name wasn't called at the funeral, when his seat remained empty, it wasn't an oversight. It was a statement. And that statement echoed through the entire service. It hung over everything that happened next. Moment 2. Bush's tribute and the art of restraint. George W. Bush took the podium to deliver the eulogy, and what he said in those moments was striking, not because it was explosive or controversial. It was striking because of what it revealed about Cheney through the eyes of someone who knew him better than almost anyone alive. Bush painted a picture of a man defined by restraint. He talked about Cheney as someone whose talent exceeded his ego. Bush called him smart and polished without airs. And then Bush said something that seemed almost like an aside, but actually went to the heart of who Cheney was. He said that Cheney lifted the standards of those around him just by being who he was. He was an old breed of public servant, Bush explained, defined by their substance and character. Bush also revealed something deeply personal from their time together. 25 years earlier, when Bush was preparing to choose a running mate for the presidency, Cheney had actually offered to withdraw from the ticket during the difficult 2004 re-election campaign. The country was in turmoil. The war in Iraq was becoming increasingly unpopular. Cheney knew he was controversial, and he was willing to step aside if Bush thought it would help him win. Bush's response at that moment was unambiguous. He said, "I concluded that there are none better than Dick Cheney." Bush explained that he was looking for someone who could seamlessly step into the presidency if something happened to him. Someone guided by judgment and integrity, not by ambition. Someone whose first concern was always the nation. And after reviewing all his options, Bush realized that man was sitting right in front of him. That was Cheney. So when Bush stood at that podium on November 20th, there was a complexity to what he was doing. He was honoring a man he had worked alongside for 8 years. He was defending certain aspects of his legacy. But he was also implicitly addressing the fact that Cheney, in his final years, had gone in a very different direction than the policies they had pursued together. Bush didn't dwell on that contradiction. He didn't need to. It was already there in the room, felt by everyone. Moment 3. Liz Cheney's final gift from her father. Liz Cheney took the podium with the weight of everything her father meant to her clearly written across her face. She's 59 years old now. She was a congresswoman. She served on the Select Committee investigating January 6th. She had become a lightning rod for controversy because she refused to support Trump despite enormous pressure from her own party. In many ways, her political career had been defined by taking difficult stands, just like her father had taught her. But that day at the cathedral, Liz wasn't speaking as a congresswoman or a political figure. She was speaking as a daughter, and what she revealed about the final moments of her father's life gave everyone in that room a glimpse of something deeply human beneath all the years of political weight. The night before Dick Cheney died, Liz described something almost ethereal. She said the sky above her parents' house had filled with clouds shaped like winged angels. She said she'd never seen anything like it before. It seemed, she explained, as though angels and archangels and all the company of heaven had come to watch over him. And then she shared the final words her father ever spoke. As Dick Cheney was leaving this earth, his last words were to tell his mother, to tell Lynn, that he loved her. Liz looked out at everyone gathered there and said, "And now, all of us who loved him so dearly say to him, 'Good night, sweet Dad. My flights of angels sing thee to thy rest.'" The entire cathedral went silent. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Liz went on to talk about the time she had spent with her father in his later years. She talked about the greatest blessing of her life being the gift of time with him. They'd sit by the fire watching football and old movies. They'd go to their grandchildren's games together. And then they had done something that took everyone back. They had gotten in a car together, and this time Liz was driving. And they had retraced journeys that Dick Cheney had taken them on 50 years earlier. They drove for hours. They talked about life and family, about history and about America. Liz described what it was like to be with her father. She said it was to know safety and love and laughter and kindness. And then she described a photograph that their mother, Lynn, had put into words perfectly. It was a picture of Dick in his cowboy hat and jeans, with a fleece jacket, his arm around one of his young grandsons. The boy was leaning into his warm embrace. That was what he was to all of them, Liz said. He was a giant to the end, a lion of a man who loved and served his great republic. Moment 4. The cardiologist's unexpected tribute. Dr. Jonathan Reiner had been Dick Cheney's cardiologist for 27 years. He started with a joke that broke some of the emotional tension in the room. He said, "No one wants a doctor who's great at funerals." But then Dr. Reiner said something profound. He described Cheney as a remarkable patient, a man who was calm, a man who never looked over his shoulder, a man who only looked ahead. Over nearly 3 decades of caring for Cheney, through multiple heart attacks, through conversations about his mortality, through the installation of a mechanical heart device in 2010, when Cheney was literally dying in the cardiac surgical intensive care unit, Reiner had watched this man face his own fragility with composure. Reiner recounted a pivotal moment in July of 2010. Cheney was in the cardiac surgical intensive care unit, literally at death's door. Reiner had to tell him that the mechanical heart assist device scheduled for the next morning couldn't wait until morning. It would be too late if they waited. That conversation, happening between a doctor and his patient in the face of imminent death, revealed something about who Cheney was. He didn't panic, he didn't rail against the unfairness of it all, he simply accepted what needed to happen and moved forward. That quality of acceptance and of facing reality head-on was what Reiner wanted everyone to know about Dick Cheney. It wasn't about politics, it was about character. Moment 5. The grandchildren remember their grandfather. 3 of Dick Cheney's 7 grandchildren took the podium to speak, and what they talked about was nothing like the speeches you might expect at a state funeral for a former vice president of the United States. They talked about normal things, family things. They talked about holiday dinners, about watching John Wayne movies together, about their grandfather's diligence about attending high school football games. One granddaughter, Elizabeth Perry, talked about going fly fishing with her grandfather. She described an incident where she and her siblings had accidentally hooked him with an out-of-control fishing cast. That's what they chose to remember, not foreign policy, not presidential politics. a fishing accident that had probably made them all laugh at the time. Those grandchildren stood up and reminded everyone in that cathedral that Dick Cheney's 8 years as vice president, as consequential as they were, represented only a fraction of his life. He was a man who loved his family fiercely. He showed up. He was present. He taught them values by example and by talking with them about history and about America. He took them to Civil War battlefields and made them read every sign at every historic site because he wanted them to understand the sacrifices that had made their freedom possible. The grandchildren's testimony was perhaps the most quietly powerful moment of the entire funeral. It was a reminder that beyond all the controversy, beyond all the political debate about his role in the Iraq War and his policy decisions as vice president, was a man who had done what mattered most. He had loved his family. He had been present for them. He had passed on his values to the next generation. Dick Cheney's funeral on November 20th, 2025, was a moment where American history and human emotion collided. It was a funeral that revealed the complexity of his legacy. Former presidents from different parties sat side by side, a Supreme Court filled, congressional leaders gathered, and yet the sitting president of the United States was conspicuously absent. What emerged from that day wasn't a simple story about a man's accomplishments or failures. What emerged was a more human portrait. A man who had served at the highest levels of government for decades, who had made consequential decisions that shaped the world, who had also survived multiple heart attacks and lived with his own mortality staring him in the face. A man who loved his wife deeply enough that his last words were a declaration of that love. A man who was a grandfather who showed up at his grandchildren's football games. A man who took his daughters on road trips to revisit their childhood journeys. That's what November 20th revealed. That's what those 5 moments at Washington National Cathedral told us about Dick Cheney in the end.